Imagine you're managing a billion-dollar thermal power plant project.
Oh, wow. High stakes right off the bat.
Right. Like the massive cooling towers are only half built. The concrete is, well, literally drying as we speak. And you have thousands of workers on site.
Yeah, a massive logistical operation.
Exactly. And suddenly, your main contractor threatens to completely walk off the job tomorrow,
Ooh.
all because of this massive payment dispute regarding a delay. I mean, in a normal corporate business environment, you'd probably just, fire them.
Yeah, you'd lawyer up, freeze your operations, and
Ugh.
just retreat to your separate corners until a judge decides who wins.
Right. But here, if they walk, the entire project collapses.
Yeah.
Like hundreds of smaller subcontractors go bankrupt instantly.
Instantly, yeah.
And you're just left with this multi-million-dollar half-built ruin. So what do you actually do?
I mean, it's a terrifying scenario, but it's one that plays out constantly in global infrastructure.
Really? Constantly.
Oh, absolutely. Because in corporate litigation, like you said, you can sever ties and calculate the damages later. But in construction, survival depends on immediate resolution.
Right. You can't just stop.
No, the machinery of conflict resolution, it has to operate smoothly while the bulldozers are literally still moving.
And that is exactly what we're exploring in this deep dive. We're taking you into the high-stakes, high-stressed world of massive construction disputes.
It's a fascinating world, really.
It is. We'll be pulling from some master-level insights into construction law, specifically looking at how the industry uses negotiation, mediation, and a very specific set of rules called the FIDI framework.
Right, to prevent these mega projects from just totally imploding.
Exactly. The mission here is to demystify how these standoffs are resolved, taking you from the raw, rigid contract clauses all the way to the intense psychological chess match of the final settlement.
Well, to really understand the mechanics of those settlements, we first have to look at why these specific disputes are so incredibly stubborn.
Okay, let's unpack this. Why are they so stubborn?
So the sources we're analyzing describe this as a structural paradox. And there are a few layers to this, starting with the most obvious one, which is the continuing relationship.
The continuing relationship.
Yeah, these two parties might absolutely despise each other, but they are contractually bound to keep working together for years.
Right. So it's essentially like trying to negotiate a messy divorce while both of you are currently forced to pedal the same tandem bicycle up a steep hill.
That is a very apt metaphor. I love that.
Because if either of you stops pedaling just to yell at the other, you both crash and burn.
Exactly. And then you add to that the second layer, which is multi-party complexity. I mean, you aren't just dealing with a simple buyer and seller here.
Right. There are so many players.
Yeah, there's an employer, a lead engineer, a main contractor, and then dozens, sometimes hundreds of subcontractors, insurers, suppliers.
It's a huge web.
It is. They are all chained together. So a single delay cascades through that entire web simultaneously.
Which brings up the technical complexity layer, right? But wait, before we go further, what exactly are they usually arguing over? Like, is it just missed invoices or is it deeper than that?
Oh, it's much deeper. They're fighting over really technical things like critical path delay analysis and quantum variations.
Okay, I'm guessing quantum variations is basically construction speak for we had to change the design of the entire foundation halfway through the dig, and now we're going to war over exactly how much that change costs.
That is precisely it. Figuring out who is legally at fault for a delay, it requires forensic engineering. It's not just a quick glance at a ledger.
Wow, so it takes a lot of time.
It does. And while you're spending months arguing over who caused yesterday's delay, you hit the fourth layer of the paradox.
Which is?
Real-time accumulation. The damages are actively compounding. A delay today becomes a massive site-wide disruption tomorrow. I mean, the financial bleeding just never stops.
So if walking away means bankruptcy for everyone on that tandem bicycle, how do you force them to keep pedaling while they fight?
Well, you can't rely on their goodwill, that's for sure.
Right, obviously not.
You have to hardwire a survival mechanism into the contract itself, way before the first shovel even hits the dirt.
Okay, and how do they do that?
The industry manages this through what's called a dispute resolution continuum. So picture a spectrum.
Okay, got it in my head.
On the far left, you have facilitative methods, things like pure negotiation or mediation, where the parties keep total control of the outcome.
They decide what happens.
Right. Then you move to the middle and you hit evaluative methods. That's where an expert neutral might step in, assess the technical merits, and maybe recommend a solution.
Okay, makes sense.
And then on the far right, you hit determinative methods.
like going to court.
Exactly. Adjudication, arbitration, or litigation. A third party steps in, imposes a legally binding outcome, and, well, usually destroys whatever microscopic shred of the working relationship was left.
Because these massive projects are inherently chaotic, the industry relies on standard architectural blueprints to impose order on that whole continuum, right?
Exactly.
And if you're building a major infrastructure project almost anywhere in the world, you're likely using a FEDIAC contract.
Yes, PVA.
It's basically this internationally recognized template for handling these exact explosions.
Yeah, the AVA 1999 Red Book, for example. It structures the escalation of a dispute very deliberately. It essentially forces the parties up a ladder.
How does that ladder start?
It starts at subclause 3.5, which is the engineer's determination. The project engineer is tasked with acting almost like an embedded diplomat.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they have to try and broker a bilateral agreement between the employer and the contractor. And if that fails, the engineer has to step back and make a fair determination of the claim.
But wait, I'd imagine no one ever really accepts the engineer's call, right? Because the engineer is usually hired by the employer, so the contractor is immediately going to scream bias.
Oh, it happens constantly. You're spot on.
Yeah.
And when that determination is rejected, we escalate to subclause 20.2 through 20.4.
Oh, well,
This introduces the Dispute Adjudication Board, or the DAB. So a panel of independent technical and legal experts is brought in, they hear the dispute, and they issue a decision.
okay, so a mini court.
Kind of. And the critical factor here is that the DAB decision is immediately binding.
Wait, binding even if you completely disagree with it?
Yes, unless a party issues a notice of dissatisfaction, an NOD, within 28 days.
Ah, okay. A loophole.
Well, even then, there is a massive legal precedent we have to look at. The Singapore Court of Appeal ruled on a landmark case known as Persero,
Persero, okay.
and they determined that DAB decisions require immediate compliance. So even if you issue an NOD because you hate the decision and you fully intend to fight it in arbitration later, you still have to pay up or comply in the interim.
That makes total sense, actually. You prioritize liquidity over fairness in the short term. The cash has to flow immediately to keep the concrete pouring, and you can just argue about getting a refund years later in arbitration.
That is the exact commercial logic behind it.
Mm.
But once that NOD is issued, we enter the most highly debated step in the entire FEDI architecture.
Ooh, which is
Subclause 20.5, amicable settlement.
amicable settlement.
Right. The contract states that once the dissatisfaction is formalized, the parties enter a 56-day window where they shall attempt amicable settlement before anyone is legally allowed to commence arbitration.
But hold on, let's look at the psychology of the room here.
Okay.
Both sides are furious. They fought through the engineer, they've battled in front of the DIB, and one of them just issued a formal legal notice saying they despise the outcome.
Yeah, tensions are high.
Right. So doesn't telling them they shall attempt settlement for 56 days just create this pointless, empty waiting room before the inevitable arbitration?
You know, what's fascinating here is that the global legal community is actually split down the middle on that very question.
Real.
Yeah. You have two distinct schools of thought. The strong interpretation, which is backed by international tribunals like ICC case 12732, views that 56-day period as a mandatory procedural condition precedent.
So no skipping it.
Exactly. It's a strict contractual obligation. You cannot accelerate to arbitration under any circumstances. You must wait out the 56 days, even if the other side refuses to pick up the phone.
Wow. And what's the opposing view? Because honestly, if I'm a contractor bleeding $1 million a week, I'm not going to sit quietly in an empty waiting room for 2 months just because a contract says so.
Naturally.
I'd send one half-hearted email, get ignored, and claim I, attempted it.
Which is exactly the argument made by the Huck and Kramer analysis. They argued that the phrase shall attempt creates an obligation of conduct, not an obligation of result.
Ah, conduct versus result.
Right. In their view, if you try in good faith to engage and the other party just slams the door in your face, you shouldn't be held hostage. You can proceed directly to arbitration.
That seems a lot more practical.
It does. But regardless of which legal theory a tribunal subscribes to, those 56 days serve as the ultimate mediation gateway.
Okay, so let's say they actually want to use that gateway. The contract dictates when they're supposed to negotiate, but it certainly doesn't tell them how to de-escalate two raging executives who have their entire careers riding on this outcome.
Oh, absolutely not.
That-
Contract law doesn't care about feelings.
Right.
So to understand that, we have to leave strict contract law behind and look at the psychology of conflict resolution. The master-level frameworks rely heavily on the Harvard program on negotiation.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, specifically the principles from Fisher, Urey, and Patton's landmark book, Getting to Yes. The philosophy rests on four pillars.
Let's hear them.
Separate the people from the problem, focus on interests rather than positions, generate options for mutual gain, and insist on objective criteria.
Separating people from the problem sounds wonderful in a textbook, but I imagine it's incredibly difficult when a contractor's position is deeply tied to their ego.
Oh, it's brutal in practice.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's put the listener right in the middle of this to see how it actually works.
Okay, let's do a scenario.
Let's take a scenario from the sources. Imagine an Indian EPC contractor, and for context, EPC means engineering, procurement, and construction. So these are the folks designing and building the entire facility.
Right.
They're building this massive 1,200 megawatt thermal power project. And the contractor claims they are owed 45 crore because the employer delayed the project by 18 months by failing to provide access to the site.
A huge delay. That's under subclause 1.9 and 2.1, typically.
Exactly. But the employer, relying on an old engineer's determination, offers a paltry euro crore. And the 56-day window just opened this morning.
Wow. Okay, so it's the perfect storm of entrenched hostility.
Yeah.
To navigate this using the Harvard principles, a negotiator first maps out the analytical triangle. That consists of the BTNA, the WTNA, and the ZOPE.
Okay, let's translate those acronyms for everyone. Let's put yourself in the contractor's shoes. Your stated position is pay me 45 crore or I walk. But what is your actual interest? Like, why do you need that specific pile of money right now?
Exactly, you have to dig deeper.
Maybe the real interest is actually just securing enough immediate cash flow to pay your furious subcontractors on Friday so they don't abandon the site and, protecting your company's credit rating.
And that's the key. Positions close the space for solutions, but interests open it.
Ah, I like that.
Once a negotiator identifies those underlying interests, they evaluate the BTNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement.
The best case scenario if talks fail.
Right. For our contractor, maybe their BTNA is enforcing that immediate DIB decision we talked about, assuming they want it. But then you must brutally evaluate the WTNA, the worst alternative.
The worst case scenario.
Yes. If negotiations fail and they file for ICC arbitration, it could take 3 to 5 years to get a final ruling. Can the contractor's cash flow survive a 5-year legal siege?
Almost certainly not. I mean, they'd go bankrupt just waiting for their victory.
Precisely.
And that sheer desperation on the contractor's side, balanced against the employer's fear of eventually losing a massive arbitration ruling, with years of interest attached, that creates the ZOPA, right? The zone of possible agreement.
Exactly. You found the ZOPA. By shifting the conversation away from the rigid, ego-driven position of 45 crore and focusing instead on the underlying interest of cash flow and project completion, new options materialize.
So you stop arguing over a single number.
Right. You stop arguing over the number and start inventing structural solutions.
Yeah.
What if the employer pays a partial uplift right now to solve the Friday payroll crisis, adds an acceleration agreement paying a bonus if the contractor finishes early, and they defer the final account balance until the plant is actually generating revenue?
Wow. But to make that complex package palatable, you can't just pull the bonus numbers out of thin air, right?
No, you can't.
That's where the final Harvard killer comes in objective criteria. You legitimize the settlement using external standards like the market rates and the bill and quantities or the Society of Construction Law's delay protocol. It shifts the dynamic from a bitter battle of wills into a shared mathematical problem-solving exercise.
In theory, yes. But we have to be realistic here.
Uh-oh.
Yes, sometimes, despite the most elegant Harvard frameworks, the parties are simply too entrenched. The math might clearly show a ZOP exists, but anger and corporate posturing are blocking the view.
They just can't see it.
Right. So when they cannot find the ZOP themselves, they need a professional neutral.
Enter the RICS mediator. RICS, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, is essentially the gold standard institutional framework for construction mediation.
It really is.
And a RICS mediator doesn't just walk into a room and ask everyone to hold hands, right? They have to methodically deconstruct the conflict.
They do. They use a 5-stage classic model: preparation, opening, exploration, negotiation, and closing. But the core of it is what they call the ACRE approach: analytical, commercial, restorative, and expert.
Expert being the key word there.
Very much so. It's crucial to understand that RICS views all construction mediation as inherently evaluative to some degree. You cannot mediate a thermal power plant dispute if you don't actually understand critical path delay.
Right, you can't bluff your way through that.
Exactly. You need deep sector expertise to look a chief engineer in the eye and provide harsh commercial reality testing on their claims.
But doing that in a joint room with everyone staring at each other is nearly impossible. I mean, no one wants to blink first.
No one.
If I'm the contractor, I'm terrified that if I offer a concession, the employer will immediately exploit it as weakness.
That is the classic prisoner's dilemma, and it's compounded by adverse selection.
What's that?
That's when parties withhold vital, potentially helpful information because they are terrified that if the mediation fails, that information will be weaponized against them in arbitration later.
Wow, so nobody's being honest.
Exactly.
Which is why the mediator utilizes the most potent tool in their arsenal, the caucus.
The caucus is brilliant.
Yeah, instead of keeping everyone at the big conference table, the mediator separates them into private rooms.
Right. The caucus is a strictly confidential space. The mediator can collect the true reservation points, the absolute rock-bottom financial line each party will actually accept.
So only the mediator gets to see the whole board.
Yes. They act as what MIT's program on negotiation calls a bonding agent, holding the disparate pieces of trust together.
I love the analogy of the mediator acting almost like an intelligence agent using a technique called noisy translation.
Oh, that's a great term.
Right, because they are the only one moving between rooms, they can walk into the employer's suite and say, look, I just spent an hour with the contractor. I cannot legally tell you their bottom line, but I can tell you that significant movement is happening. If you adjust your offer on the subcontractor payments by just 10%, I believe we have a bridge.
It is brilliant.
It is. The mediator signals momentum without ever compromising the secret reservation point of the other side.
It is highly effective at breaking deadlocks. But it requires an immense level of ethical constraint.
Because they have all the secrets.
Exactly. The mediator has an information monopoly. They must remain entirely impartial and never exploit that disparity to strong-arm a weaker party into a bad deal just to get a win on their resume.
Wow, yeah. And even assuming you have a brilliant ethical mediator, the parties still have to make broader strategic choices about what style of mediation they need. Because not every dispute requires someone digging into deep emotional interests.
That's true. To navigate that, industry experts use Riskin's mediator orientation grid.
Okay, how does that work?
It maps mediation styles on two axes: facilitative versus evaluative, and broad versus narrow problem definition. So, for example, if you were 2 years into a 10-year public-private partnership, you absolutely want a facilitative broad approach.
Because you need to work together for another 8 years.
Right. The mediator needs to focus on repairing communication to preserve that decade-long marriage.
But if you are fighting over a highly technical defect liability claim, say, the concrete in the cooling tower is cracking, you don't need a marriage counselor.
Definitely not.
You need an evaluative, narrow approach. The mediator needs to look strictly at the engineering reports, evaluate the legal liability, and tell you who is at fault before anyone even begins to discuss a financial settlement.
Exactly. And sometimes pure mediation isn't enough, and parties turn to hybrid models. The most common is MedArb, where the mediator transitions into an arbitrator if the talks fail.
You know, I've always found MedArb logically flawed.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Why would I ever reveal my deepest weaknesses and true bottom line to a mediator if I know that tomorrow morning they might put on a judge's robe and use that exact information to issue a binding ruling against me?
You've hit on the exact procedural fairness risk that plagues MedArb. It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And it is precisely why the reverse hybrid ArbMed is gaining massive traction, particularly in Asian infrastructure projects.
ArbMed, okay. How is that different?
In ArbMed, the arbitral tribunal hears the entire case first. They deliberate and they write their final legally binding award.
Okay.
But they don't publish it. They seal it in an envelope, place it on the table, and then the parties enter mediation.
Wait, really? That is the ultimate psychological pressure cooker.
It really is.
The arbitrator literally puts the final answer in a sealed envelope inches from your hands while you try to talk it out.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is pure psychological leverage, and it works beautifully. It introduces a massive, undeniable threat into the room.
I can imagine.
It strips away all the posturing and delusions of grandeur. You can't bluff about having an unbeatable legal strategy when the actual binding legal reality is sitting in a manila envelope staring at you. It forces incredibly realistic commercial settlements.
But once you finally reach that settlement, you need teeth to enforce it. Nobody wants to spend 56 days agonizing over an amicable settlement, finally sign a deal, and then watch the other side simply refuse to transfer the funds.
No, that would be a nightmare. But the enforcement landscape has evolved dramatically to prevent that. For example, under the new India Mediation Act 2023, a mediated settlement agreement, an MSA that is properly authenticated, is enforceable directly as a court decree.
Oh, wow. So it has real power immediately.
Exactly. There is only a tiny 90-day window to challenge it, and the grounds are restricted to severe issues like outright fraud.
And internationally, under the SID8 framework, if arbitration had already commenced before the settlement was reached, the parties can take their private agreement and record it as a consent award under rules like ICC Article 33.
Which is huge.
It is. It takes a private handshake and transforms it into a legal mandate that is enforceable in almost every country on Earth under the New York Convention.
It creates certainty, yes. But we also have to look objectively at where these systems fail, because the frameworks aren't perfect, and the sources highlight two massive blind spots: power asymmetry and multi-party complexity.
Well, power asymmetry is brutal in construction. If you have a massive, well-capitalized employer going up against a financially distressed contractor, the employer knows the contractor's Watinane going to ICC arbitration for 5 years is basically a death sentence.
Exactly. They won't survive it.
The contractor will fold long before they get an award. So the employer can weaponize that 56-day mediation gateway to starve the contractor out and force a heavily discounted, unfair settlement.
And that leads directly into the second major structural flaw. Remember the tandem bicycle with 30 people pedaling?
Oh, right, the subcontractors.
Yes. Subclause 20.5 under EDI is designed as a bilateral mediation. It is strictly between the employer and the main contractor. But construction disputes are almost never bilateral.
Right. The subcontractors, the suppliers, the scaffold, they all have overlapping claims and are suffering from the delays, yet they are structurally locked out of the mediation room where their financial fate is being decided.
Which brings us to a really fascinating endpoint. We have traced the anatomy of these disputes, from the compounding chaos of the construction site up the strict FID escalation ladder.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
We've seen how Harvard's interest-based negotiation can mathematically uncover a zone of possible agreement, how a RICS mediator uses the caucus to bypass the prisoner's dilemma, and how a sealed envelope in ArbMed can shatter corporate egos.
It's an incredible ecosystem of pressure and pragmatism. And while we've been talking about billion-dollar power plants, the core psychology separating the person from the problem, rigorously assessing your alternatives before you walk away, and focusing on underlying interests rather than stated demands. I mean, that applies just as much to a high-stakes boardroom negotiation or even navigating a heated conflict in your own household.
Oh, absolutely. The human element is the same. But there is one final lingering question raised by the master text that we should leave the listener with.
Okay, what is it?
We established that the standard bilateral mediation structurally excludes the subcontractors. Yet those subcontractors are usually the ones bearing the actual brutal financial brunt of a site delay.
Yeah, they're the ones really hurting.
So the question is, are these multi-million-dollar globally enforced settlements genuinely resolving the underlying health of the project?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Or are the top two tiers of the contractual pyramid simply executing a sophisticated legal handshake to protect themselves while the foundation of the project quietly burns?
Wow. It is a profound question about the limits of contract law versus the reality of human enterprise.
It really makes you think.
Definitely something to ponder the next time you drive past a massive skyline filled with grains. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Remember, no matter how complex the rules of engagement are, sometimes the absolute hardest part is just figuring out how to keep pedaling that tandem bicycle up the hill together.